A coffee tray slipped and crashed against the floor. White cups burst apart across the linoleum. A woman's knees folded under her, and she fell forward, toward the hard edge of a table. A man moved before anyone could blink. He shot out of his chair, one arm out, and caught her just above the ground. His dog was already up, ears flat, standing over both of them. The whole diner went silent. Nobody breathed. He turned her face gently toward the light, and that's when he saw them. Yellow bruises down her arm. A fresh split on her jaw. His voice came out low and even. 4 words. "Who hurt you?" She wouldn't answer him. But the dog wouldn't leave her side, and the man's eyes had already moved to the pawn shop next door. What happened next nobody in there saw coming. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up and tell you how she ended up on that floor. The place was called the Copper Kettle, a low brick diner off the highway in Barstow, California, the kind of town where the heat comes off the asphalt in waves and the trucks never really stop. Delia Krantz had been on her feet since before sunrise. She'd worked the breakfast rush, and then the lunch rush, and now she was deep into a double she couldn't afford to turn down. Her feet were swollen. Her hands shook a little when she poured. But she kept smiling because that was the job, and because a smile hid a lot of things. She wore a collar buttoned up too high for a 100-degree day. That collar did a lot of work. Under it was a bruise on her collarbone, going green at the edges. On her jaw was a fresh mark, red and swollen, the kind you get from the back of a hand. She'd covered it with makeup that morning, but 8 hours of sweat had worn most of it away. Anybody who looked close could see it. The thing was, nobody in Barstow looked close. People had learned not to. Now, here's the part you need to understand. Delia wasn't weak. She ran that whole floor by herself most days. She knew every trucker by name, knew how they took their coffee, knew which ones tipped and which ones stiffed her. She'd buried a husband and buried her savings along with him, and she'd kept the lights on anyway. This was not a woman who fell apart. But she was afraid. And the reason she was afraid stood 40 feet away, behind the counter of the pawn shop that shared a wall with the diner. His name was Merl Tanner. He ran Tanner's Loan and Trade, and for the last 2 years he'd been Delia's boyfriend, though that word never sounded right in her mouth. Merl was the kind of man who was charming in a crowd, and something else entirely behind a closed door. He'd started small. A grip on the arm. A word about her weight. Then it got worse, the way it always does. And Merl had a special kind of power over her, because when Delia's diner had fallen behind on its payments, it was Merl who'd bought up the note from the bank. Merl held the paper on the copper kettle. He liked to remind her of that. He liked to say it soft, so it sounded almost like a kindness. "This whole place is mine anytime I want it, sweetheart. Don't forget who takes care of you." She hadn't forgotten. She couldn't. On this particular afternoon, the bell over the door jingled, and a different kind of crowd came in. 10 of them, maybe 12. Leather vests, road dust, boots that hit the floor like they meant it. Outside, a row of Harleys sat gleaming in the sun. These were Hell's Angels, a chapter running east through the desert, and they'd pulled off the highway looking for coffee and pie and a place to sit that had air conditioning. The diner tensed the way any small room does when big men walk in. But these men were polite. They took off their sunglasses. They said please and thank you. They pushed 3 tables together in the corner and sat down easy. At the head of them sat a man they called Deacon. His real name was Cole Hargrove, and he was the road captain, which meant he was the one who kept the others in line on the highway. He was maybe 55, silver in his beard, forearms like knotted rope. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. When he spoke, the others leaned in. And at his feet lay an old German shepherd named Ranger, gray in the muzzle, calm as still water, the kind of dog that had seen a lot of years and wasn't impressed by much anymore. Delia went to their table because it was her table. All of it was her table. She poured coffee down the line, steady as she could manage, and when she got to Deacon, he looked up at her and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and that was all. But his eyes went to her jaw for half a second, and then to her buttoned collar, and then back to his coffee. He didn't say anything. He filed it away. That's the kind of man he was. Now, what Delia didn't know was that Merl had been watching through the window that connected the 2 shops, a little pass-through he'd cut into the wall so he could keep an eye on her. He didn't like her serving those men. He didn't like the way they said thank you to her. And around 3 o'clock, when the diner had thinned out and only the bikers remained, Merl came through the side door with a look on his face that Delia knew too well. "You're 2 hours over your shift," he said. "Loud enough for the room. I got the books to do, and you're out here flirting." "I'm working, Merl," she said quietly. "Table needs a refill." "Table can wait." He grabbed the coffee pot out of her hand, hard, and hot coffee sloshed over her wrist. She flinched. He saw her flinch, and something ugly moved behind his eyes, the way it always did when he sensed her fear. He liked that fear. It was the whole point. That was the moment. She turned to carry a full tray back to the counter, 4 cups and a pot, and her hands were shaking, and her wrist was burning, and 8 hours of standing caught up with her all at once. Her vision went white at the edges. Her knees stopped holding, and the tray hit the floor. You already know what happened next. Deacon was up and across the room before the cups finished shattering. He caught her. Ranger was on his feet, standing over the both of them, a low sound coming from his chest that wasn't quite a growl but was close. Deacon lowered her gently into a chair. He crouched in front of her. He turned her face toward the window light, and he saw the bruises down her arm and the fresh mark on her jaw, and he asked those 4 quiet words that the whole room heard. "Who hurt you?" Delia's eyes went straight to the floor. She wouldn't look at him. "I fainted," she whispered. "It's the heat." "I'm fine." "I'm so sorry about your coffee." "I didn't ask about the coffee," Deacon said. "Still soft. Still even. I asked who hurt you." She didn't answer. But she didn't have to. Because that's when Merl made his mistake. He stepped forward all bluster and said, "She's fine, pal. She does this for attention. Now finish your pie and mind your own." And Ranger left Deacon's side. The old dog walked slow and deliberate across the linoleum, past the broken cups, and put himself between Merl and Delia's chair. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He just stood there, facing Merl, hackles up along his spine, and looked at the man with the flat, patient eyes of an animal who has already decided something. Merl stopped talking. Deacon stood up. He didn't rush it. He came up to his full height slow, and he looked over at Merl, and then he looked at the little pass-through window in the wall, and then at the sign over the door next door. Tanner's Loan and Trade. He put the pieces together in about 2 seconds. The way Delia had flinched. The way the man came through the side door like he owned it. The way she'd said sorry to a stranger for a broken cup while her jaw was swelling. "You run the pawn shop next door," Deacon said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Merl said, and he found some of his swagger again, because he always did in front of a woman he thought he controlled. "And I run this diner too, matter of fact. Hold the note on it myself. So whatever you think you saw, you didn't." Delia here's clumsy. "Aren't you, Delia?" Delia said nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at them like they belonged to someone else. Deacon looked at her a long moment. Then he looked back at Merl, and he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it at all. "All right," Deacon said. "All right." And then, to everyone's surprise, he backed off. He told his men to settle down. He picked up the broken cups himself, crouched down and gathered the pieces with his own hands, and set them on the counter. He paid for the pie and the coffee, and he left a $100 bill on the table, and he told Delia to sit and rest and not worry about the mess. He tipped his head to Merl, polite as you please. "Sorry for the trouble," he said. "Long day. We'll get out of your hair." Merl puffed up like he'd won something. "Yeah. You do that." The bikers finished their coffee. They filed out into the heat, one by one, boots on the floor, and the Harleys fired up outside in a long rolling thunder, and then they pulled onto the highway and were gone. The diner went quiet again. The AC hummed. Delia let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like an hour. Merl grinned, wiped down the counter, told her to sweep up the glass, and went back through the side door to his shop like nothing had happened at all. It was over. She was sure it was over. She swept up the glass and she thought, well, that's that. And part of her ached because for 1 minute a stranger had looked at her like she mattered. And now he was 40 miles down the road and she was still here, and nothing had really changed. That's what she thought. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Delia opened the diner at 5 like she always did. Merl came in at 7, and he was in a mood, because word had gotten around town that a whole chapter of Hell's Angels had rolled through and made him look small in his own girlfriend's diner. Small was the one thing Merl could not stand to be. He came through the side door, and he didn't say good morning. He grabbed her by the arm, right there in the empty diner, hard enough to leave a print, and he pulled her close and said, low and mean, "You embarrassed me yesterday." "Merl, I fainted. You made me look like nothing in front of those men." His fingers dug in. "You think they're coming back for you. Nobody's coming back for you. You're mine. This diner's mine. Say it." And that's when the bell over the door rang. Deacon walked in. Alone this time. Ranger at his side. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who'd had a long think overnight and had made up his mind about something. "Morning," Deacon said. "Coffee if it's on." Merl let go of Deleia's arm fast. "We're closed," he snapped. "Sign says open." Deacon pulled out a stool at the counter and sat down, easy, like he had all the time in the world. Ranger lay down at the foot of the stool. "I'll take that coffee, Delia. When you get a minute." Now, this is the part where everything changed. Because Merl, who had spent his whole life pushing on people who couldn't push back, decided this was a man he could bully too. He came around the counter and he reached under it, and when his hand came up, it had a pistol in it. He set it on the counter, hand still on it, barrel pointed nowhere in particular, which is its own kind of threat. "I told you." Merl said, "We're closed. Here's what I want you to notice." Deacon did not stand up. He did not reach for anything. He looked at the gun on the counter, and he looked at Merle's hand on the gun, and he sighed like a man who'd seen this exact scene 100 times and was tired of it. "Son," Deacon said quietly, "you don't want to have pulled that. I'm not scared of you." "I know you're not," Deacon said. "That's your problem. A smart man would be." He turned his coffee cup right side up on its saucer, calm as Sunday. "Let me tell you what I did last night, Merl." "That is your name, right?" "Merl Tanner. Last night I made a couple phone calls. See, I've been running this desert a long time. And a pawn shop out on a highway that takes in a lot of merchandise nobody can account for. That's a thing people notice. So I had somebody I trust make some inquiries." Merle's hand tightened on the gun. But something in his face had changed. "This is the moment the whole thing turned, and I need you to stay with me, because it stops being about a slap in a diner right here. It becomes something a lot bigger. You've been running stolen goods through that shop for 3 years." Deacon said, never once raising his voice. "Farm equipment, copper wire, a whole trailer of power tools out of a job site in Victorville last spring. You fence it out of state. And here's the thing that ought to worry you. It's not my problem. I don't care about your merchandise. But there are people who do care. Real ones. The kind with badges that your cousin the sheriff can't call off because they're 2 levels above him. State people. They've had a file on you for a while. They just didn't have a reason to move on it yet." The diner was dead silent. Delia stood frozen with the coffee pot in her hand. "Now look, before this goes any further, let me say one quick thing to you, because you've stayed with me this long. If a story about a quiet man standing up for somebody who couldn't stand up for themselves is the kind of thing you're here for, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel, and it means the next person who needs to hear a story like this one finds it. All right. Back to that diner and back to Merle, whose hand was still on the gun. "You're bluffing," Merle said. But his voice had gone thin. "Maybe," Deacon said. "You want to bet your life on maybe. Because here's how this goes. You keep that hand on that gun, you've got 2 choices and both of them are bad. Either you use it, in which case there are 11 men who know exactly where I am this morning and exactly whose shop shares a wall with this diner, and you'll spend what's left of your life in a box. Or you don't use it, in which case you've pulled a gun on me for nothing, and now I'm insulted." He let that sit. "Take your hand off it, Merl." For a long moment nobody moved. Ranger had lifted his head off the floor and was watching Merl with those flat, patient eyes. And Merl took his hand off the gun. Deacon reached over slow and slid the pistol down the counter out of reach and set it in the sink. He never once broke eye contact, and he never once raised his voice. "Good," he said. "Now we can talk like men. But we're not at the end yet. Not close. Because a bully like Merl doesn't get fixed by having a gun taken away." Merl backed toward the side door, and he was shaking now, but it was the shaking of a cornered animal, and those are the dangerous ones. "You don't get to come into my town," he hissed, "and my diner and my—" He pointed at Delia. "She's mine. You hear me? That paper on this place has my name on it. I can put her out on the street tomorrow. I can have this whole diner bulldozed. You want to play hero biker? You just cost her everything she's got." And there it was. The real weapon. Not the gun. The paper. Delia set the coffee pot down because her hands had started to shake. "It's true," she said, barely above a whisper. "He holds the note. Everything I have is in this building. If he calls it, I lose all of it. My husband's in the ground, and this diner's the only thing I've got left of the life we built. That's why I—" Her voice broke. "That's why I never said anything. There's nothing anybody can do. He owns it. He owns all of it." The room went quiet. Deacon stood up off the stool. He walked over to Delia, slow, and he stood in front of her, and he did something nobody expected. He took off his glove and he held out his hand, and when she gave him hers, he turned it over gentle and looked at the burn on her wrist from the coffee, and the old bruise, and he held her hand like it was something that mattered. "Ma'am," he said, "I want you to listen to me because I'm only going to say this once. Nobody owns you. Not a man and not a piece of paper." He looked over his shoulder at Merl. "As for the note, here's what's going to happen. You're going to sit down, and we're going to make a phone call, and you're going to sell that note this morning. To me." Merl laughed ugly. "I'm not selling you a damn thing." "You are," Deacon said. "And here's why. Because in about an hour, a man named Hollies is going to pull up outside. Hollies handles the club's legitimate business, and believe me, we've got plenty of it, because a club this old learned a long time ago that paper beats fists 9 times out of 10. Hollies is going to offer you fair market value for that note. Fair. More than fair. Because I don't want you saying anybody robbed you. And you're going to take it, and you're going to sign it over, and you're going to be gone from this town by sundown. And if I don't, then Hollies doesn't come. The state people do." Deacon's voice never moved. "I've got the file number written down in my vest. All it takes is one more phone call, and instead of walking away with a check in your pocket, you walk away in cuffs, and every dime you've got gets seized, and that note gets tied up in a court for 3 years, while a judge sorts out which of your assets came from stolen goods. Either way, Merl, you lose the note. The only question is whether you lose it standing up, with money in your hand, or lose it on your knees with nothing. I'd think hard. You're not a smart man, but even you can do this math. You could hear the clock on the wall ticking. That's how quiet it was. Merl looked at the gun in the sink. He looked at Deacon. He looked at Ranger, still watching him, and at the 11 empty stools where 11 men had sat the day before, and he understood, finally, that the thing he'd counted on his whole life, that nobody big enough would ever notice, that nobody would ever push back, had run out on him. He'd built his little kingdom on the certainty that the people around him were too small and too scared to do anything. And a man had walked in who wasn't small and wasn't scared, and the whole thing had come down in a single morning. Fine. Merl spat. But his shoulders had dropped. Fine. I'll sell the note. But this dump isn't worth what you think it is, and neither is she. And that was the wrong last thing to say. Because Merl turned toward Delia one more time, out of pure spite, and he raised his hand the way he'd raised it 100 times before, the reflex of a man who'd never once faced a consequence for it. He raised his hand to strike her in front of everybody, as if the last 2 years had taught him nothing at all. He never landed it. Deacon caught his wrist in midair. One hand held it there, frozen, the two of them locked, and Merl strained against it and couldn't move it an inch, because Deacon had forearms like knotted rope and 40 years of holding onto things that didn't want to be held. And Ranger was up, standing right at Merl's leg, that low sound rolling out of his chest at last. Deacon didn't hit him. That's the thing you have to understand about this whole story. He never threw a single punch. He just held Merl's wrist there in the air, and he leaned in close, and he said, so quiet only Merl could hear it, "You don't ever raise your hand to her again. Not today. Not in a memory. Not in a dream. You're going to spend the rest of your life a long way from here, being nobody, in some town where nobody's scared of you. And every time you think about coming back, you're going to remember this morning and how it felt when a stranger held your arm in the air and you couldn't do a thing about it. That's your whole future, Merl. That right there." And then he let go. Merl stumbled back, cradling his wrist, and the fight went out of him all at once, and he looked for the first time like exactly what he was. A small, mean man who'd only ever been big because everyone around him agreed to be smaller. Holly showed up an hour later, just like Deacon said. Quiet fellow, reading glasses, a leather satchel full of paperwork. There was a check, and there was a document, and Merl signed the note over at the counter of the diner while Delia watched, and his hand shook the whole time. Deacon had been telling the truth about the price. It was fair. More than fair. Merl walked out with a check big enough that he had no grounds to complain to anybody, which was exactly the point, because Deacon didn't want a war. He wanted it clean. By sundown, just like Deacon said, Merl Tanner was gone. He loaded up his truck and he drove out of Barstow, and he never came back. The state file, as it turned out, was real. 6 weeks later, some men in plain sedans came asking about a pawn shop and some stolen power tools. But by then the shop was shuttered and Merl was 3 states away, and that became somebody else's story. But this story, this one, ends back at the Copper Kettle. Deacon handed Delia the note that afternoon. The actual paper. The thing that had hung over her head for 2 years. He set it on the counter in front of her, and he pushed it across, and he said, "This is yours now. Free and clear. I'm not holding it. There's no strings and there's no debt. It's your diner. It always should have been." Delia stared at it. She didn't understand at first. "You paid Merl for this. That's your money. I can't. You're not going to argue with me about it," Deacon said, and there was almost a smile in it. "The club's got money, Delia. What it doesn't have enough of is places to stop that treat people right. You poured me a cup of coffee and said thank you when you were the one who deserved thanking. That's worth more than a note on a building. Consider the club a regular customer. We'll be through here twice a month, and we tip good, and we don't break the cups." He looked down at the floor, where the ghost of yesterday's broken tray still seemed to hang in the air. "Well, not usually." And Delia Krantz, who had not cried in front of another human being in 2 years, who had held it together through a husband's funeral and a lost savings account, and 100 nights of being told she was nothing, put her face in her hands right there at the counter of her own diner and finally let it go. Deacon didn't crowd her. He just stood there steady and let her have it. Ranger came around the counter and put his gray head in her lap, and she wrapped her arms around that old dog's neck and cried into his fur, and the dog held still and let her, the way he'd stood over her the day before, the way he'd known before any of the men had known that this was a person worth standing over. Here's the part I keep thinking about. The day before, Deacon had caught her before she hit the floor. He'd put his arm out and stopped her fall with his own strength, because she couldn't hold herself up. But now, weeks later, when the bikers rolled through on their twice-a-month stop, Delia met them at the door standing on her own 2 feet, chin up, collar open in the heat because she had nothing left to hide. The bruises had faded, and they didn't come back. She'd hired a girl to help with the double shifts. She'd painted the front of the building a color she liked instead of the color Merl had picked. Over the pawn shop next door, there was a new sign now, because Delia had bought that building too, with a good year's profits and a small loan she'd earned honest. She'd knocked out the wall between the 2 shops and made the diner twice as big. Right where Merle's counter used to be, she put a booth in the corner, the best one in the house, with a little brass plate on the wall that said reserved. And every time the angels came through, that booth was theirs, and nobody else ever sat in it. Deacon asked her once, sitting in that booth, why she never had it engraved with the club's name or with his. Delia thought about it. She looked out the window at the highway and the heat coming off the asphalt, and she said, "Because it's not about you being big, Deacon." Merl was big. Big was never the thing. She set his coffee down in front of him, the way she had the first day, steady hands now, no shake in them at all. "You asked me a question that day." 4 words. Nobody had ever asked me that. Everybody in this town saw and looked away for 2 years, and you sat down for 1 cup of coffee and you asked. Her voice was even. "That's what the booth's for. So the next tired person who comes through that door and thinks nobody sees them knows that somebody once did." Deacon didn't say anything to that. He just nodded slow and reached down and scratched Ranger behind the ears, and the old dog thumped his tail once against the floor. And that was the whole of it. No shots fired. No man in the ground. Just a bully who found out, too late, that the quiet ones are the ones you have to worry about, and a woman who found out that she'd been strong the entire time and had only been waiting for one person to notice. They say around Barstow now that if you ever break down out on that stretch of highway, the safest place to wait for help is a diner called the Copper Kettle, where the coffee's always on, and the woman who runs it will look you right in the eye. And if you're the kind of person who's used to being looked past, that alone might be the thing that saves you. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't raise its voice at all. Sometimes it's just a big man in a leather vest and an old gray dog catching somebody the world had already decided to let fall.